So my name is Georg. I'm an InnerSource evangelist, work at Bosch in Germany and also in the InnerSource Commons Foundation. And I had the privilege of being able to start my InnerSource journey rather early, so a bit more than 15 years ago. And I remember that many times during this journey, I was surprised. Like, why do I have to do this? And why does that person want to talk to me? And so things that I didn't have on my radar, and hopefully this presentation can serve as an early warning, so to speak, for those who are just starting their journey and maybe even for those who've been at it for a while. So before we go into what we need for InnerSource, let's agree on what we actually want to achieve. What's the target state? And to put it in a picture, basically, on a very high level, this is what I want. We want people to reuse existing code rather than developing it themselves, contribute back, and that way provide value for the company that they work in. Right? That's, in a nutshell, what we want to achieve in a company. Now, the question is, what do we need to make this happen? Right? So, in other words, what needs to go onto our laundry list that we should take care of in order to achieve success? And I would like to approach this in a structured way and first think about the kind of things, like the search fields that we need to look into for the things that we need to do. So let's look at this picture here again. But what do we need, obviously, to make this collaboration happen? Well, the collaboration platform like GitHub, GitLab, or the likes. So there's definitely technical stuff on our laundry list, so to speak. That's one search field. The second one is, if we want people to collaborate with each other, they first have to know about InnerSource. And it sounds trivial, but it is anything but reaching all the developers in a big company. So outreach is definitely part of the things that you have to do. So I would call that social stuff, right? Maybe there's more. Next one is, even though these two developers work in the same company, they might actually work in different legal entities. And if they collaborate across legal entity borders, there are laws for that. Transfer pricing, which regulates how that transfer of value has to happen. So we have legal stuff on the laundry list. And finally, if you run this in an organization, especially one that has no open source background, you want to support your developers and perhaps also the people who run your collaboration platform. Just as examples, that is usually done by the OSPO or the ISPO. So there's the last category, there's organizational stuff that we have to take care of. So let's use this list as our input for searching. So let's look at the technical stuff. The obvious thing is, yes, you want a collaboration platform. We started without one actually, so it's possible, but I wouldn't recommend it, especially because there are so good platforms out there like GitHub or Bitbucket. So hosting your Git repositories, pull request workflows, stuff like that. In addition to that, you probably also want is some infrastructure, preferably free infrastructure, like for instance, an issue tracker if it's not part of your collaboration platform, or CI/CD runner, stuff like that. And especially if your company is running or your InnerSource program is based on voluntarism, you don't want your developers to have to ask their manager, hey, can I please get money for this tool and that tool and the other tool? Ideally, it's available for free for them. Otherwise, it could be a barrier. Discoverability has been mentioned several times in the talk before this one. If you want people to reuse stuff, obviously they have to be able to find it. And if you have a couple of thousand of repositories, this can be really a challenge. In the past, it was mostly focusing on portals, and increasingly large language models come into play as well. Next one, data collection, something that I thought I could avoid, but apparently we can't. At some point, you will be asked for metrics, right? You have to compile metrics for the various stakeholders that you have. And also, you can use that data to steer your InnerSource initiative in the right directive and maybe discover where you have problems that you can improve, for instance. A linter is nice to help your maintainers maintain their repositories in a way that's compliant with regulations and fosters contribution. Actually, there was a really great talk yesterday by SAP. They showed their approach to the linting, and I would really recommend you guys watching that again if you haven't seen it. And lastly, anything that you can automate, both for your developers and your OSPO, you should automate. Like, for instance, requesting projects templates, or if you have a gatekeeping process, the sign-off process. So automation and workflows, I think, are an essential part of that. So much about technology. Let's talk about the social angle of the whole thing. Again, this is the obvious one, developer outreach. Your developers will carry you. They're the basis of your whole, if there are no developers, then your InnerSource initiative will not be successful. So you have to be sure to find your developers, right? And we totally underestimated this, I have to confess. So, use all the channels that you can get and make InnerSource known, reach developers, figure out what they want, what they need. And that's developer outreach. Next one, you want to do the same for management, middle management specifically, but also product owners, central functions you have to deal with. More about that later. What I have found works well, and I've learned from Denise, is outside in marketing, like other companies telling your manager, hey, you're doing a great job in InnerSource. Why don't you do more, for instance? And also what we learned is that a business case for InnerSource goes a long way in convincing managers, especially these ones here. This is probably one of the most important stakeholders. You will want someone on the board sponsoring your InnerSource initiative because, first of all, it gives credibility. And it also lends weight to the message that, yes, your company wants to do InnerSource. And it helps you have that conversation with central functions if there's an executive behind it, obviously. Documentation, obviously, like some information for people so that they can get started quickly, FAQs, how-tos, and so on. Community management. I'm a fan of community over code, the Apache motto. And I think your community is an essential part of growing and scaling your InnerSource initiative. So inform, involve, and grow your community. And that's almost a full-time job already, depending on how big it is. And lastly, you probably want to give your colleagues a chance to get a face-to-face with you or contact you without them having to set up an appointment. Because for some, that's a barrier. So if you open an open hour, that's a great format, that allows people to engage with you in a low barrier kind of way. So that's the social part. Now to the very big one, the organizational stuff, especially in big companies. So I think the first order of business should be to know whom should I be talking to in your company. So stakeholder management. I remember being surprised when someone told me, oh, you guys have to talk to the Workers' Council. Why would I have to talk to the Workers' Council? And why does the tax department want to talk to me? And you probably want to know that early rather than being surprised by a stakeholder being ignored later. So stakeholder management, important part. If you can anchor InnerSource in your company strategy or your software development strategy, that goes a long way of convincing middle management. So if you can get your executive sponsor in making that happen, that would be fantastic. We've talked about this one also. Sorry about that. There were some talks about getting time for contributions. Wolfgang, I think you mentioned that. That is hard in times where things are running fine, and that is really, really hard in times of crisis. So you want to set up, ideally, incentives or some sustainable way of getting time for people to contribute. And the same is true, in a sense, for a career path. You want to make sure that people who contribute to InnerSource projects, sometimes like as a side job, so to speak, next to their day job, that is not detrimental for their career. And ideally, it is part of their career path. So if you can establish that with HR, it goes a long way of sustaining contributions. Next one, what I've seen often is that the projects recognize by themselves that, yes, InnerSource is the way to go. But if they've never done it before, they probably need some help with that. And consulting, coaching, and possibly mentoring goes a long way there. So you'd have an offer there as well. Training goes into a similar vein. You want to make sure that people know what InnerSource looks like and how it works, especially how to be compliant in companies like ours, where the legality principle is really important. So policy is definitely something that you need to translate all the various legal requirements, the company regulations, into something that's actionable for the people who are doing InnerSource. And unless you're working in a really small startup, you also will need some governance to manage the risks that are inherent in InnerSource. And in the middle of it all, because it's orchestrating and running the whole show, is the ISPO or the OSPO. Actually, we've been doing InnerSource for 15 years, and we had a couple of years in between where we did not have a central team. And from the beginning, the contributions were going up and up and up. And then there was this period where we didn't have the ISPO, and we see that the flywheel was continuing, it was still going up, and then it started declining. because people were having questions that were not being answered. There was a demand for a new kind of license that was not satisfied in a couple of years. And there was sort of, I would call it organizational debt, piling up. And that actually led to people contributing less. And as soon as we established the InnerSource program office, the OSPO rather, we saw that contributions were going up again. And last year we actually had a record year. So this is an absolute must, in my opinion. And the last group, legal stuff, also the least fun group, I would say. Export control is one. If you are operating in multiple countries and you are doing an InnerSource program where people exchange code between these countries, export control laws apply because software is technology. That is a tough nut to crack. Many have reported. The same is true for transfer pricing, which happens even then if you collaborate within one country, but in different legal entities, then transfer pricing laws already apply. Maybe watch the talk of Wolfgang earlier to see how they solve this problem. In my experience, most of the companies, including mine, unfortunately, did not disclose how they solve these problems. Hopefully that changes in the future, but definitely something you need to be aware of. And lastly, licensing, so copyright law. You want to make sure who can actually grant an InnerSource license if you have one and what it allows. And then there are also issues of compatibility with open source licenses and all that. So those are the legal topics. Now the whole picture looks like this. Quite a lot, isn't it? Pretty daunting. But when you start your InnerSource initiatives, I like to use this iceberg picture. You usually only think of the things that are above surface, the technical stuff that's obvious for us developers, and all the rest down below is not necessarily on a radar, so to speak. And the obvious question is, do I have to do all of this to be successful? I think the answer is no, but keep in mind that there are dependencies between these. Just as an example, if you find that agree on a legal framework for your InnerSource initiative, have taken care of export control, transfer pricing, and licensing, you probably want to document that in a policy. Policy is usually input for the governance and the subject for training. And you want to document your policy in a way that your managers, those who have to sign off on people doing InnerSource, are aware of that and understand that the risks are managed properly. Also, the policy usually, at least in my experience, influences how we operate our platforms, our collaboration platforms, and sometimes there are requirements for data collection as part of your governance job. So these things tend to come in groups, so to speak. Question is now where to start, right? You can't do everything from the start. We just full disclosure, we haven't solved every problem yet, even though we've been at it for a long time. But there are a couple of things that I think are essential and, should be taken care of from the very beginning. And it really depends on what context you're in, or your experience within an open source and, your company culture, of course. But I would say we would definitely start with having an executive air cover, like a sponsor that helps you have this conversation with the organization and change your culture. And in helping getting the ISPO and OSPO started, because that's usually a non-trivial investment. It's usually, in our case, there are 4 people working for InnerSource alone and more for open source. And they are the ones who, get the show on the road and keep it there. And one of the first things I think they need to do is look at what the stakeholders are, figure out whom they should talk to, and do it early rather than later. A lesson that Siemens has learned, by the way, is that involving your lawyers, your tax lawyers, and the other central functions early on in defining the legal framework is super helpful, because there's buy-in, and it's much better than discovering later that you're running a show that is not compliant with law. So you should do that, I think. Once you have that, you need to document, of course, what is allowed and what isn't, and establish some governance. Then ideally, you need also some documentation, because once your developers start coming, you don't want everyone to contact you and ask how it works. Rather, you have a documentation to scale it up. And then I would start the platform, start my developer outreach. And once the thing is going, the flywheel is starting to turn. That comes later. Do community management as well. And again, data collection, I would say start from the very beginning, because you do want that baseline to document, to have proof, so to speak, that InnerSource does what it's supposed to do. So, and regarding in community management and whom to address, This is usually my guideline. The first thing you want to do is unblock the ones who want to do inner source in the first place, the innovators or the early adopters. There's a lot of focus on unblocking. Then you probably want to empower the early majority. And only after that, I would focus on those who haven't engaged with inner source yet, which will be a huge group, I'm sure, and help drive inner source into the rest of the organization. I wouldn't try to do everything all together. So, and that's the inner source laundry list. And that's basically it for me. And the customary greeting at the end, may the inner source be with you.